Arthur Sterling, a name whispered with reverence in architectural circles, synonymous with groundbreaking design and breathtakingly stark minimalism, inhabited a world of carefully curated silence. His mansion, perched on a windswept bluff overlooking the restless Atlantic, was a testament to his genius, a symphony of glass and steel, angles and voids. But most nights, the vast, echoing halls, adorned with museum-worthy modern art and rare, almost unsettlingly perfect artifacts, were chillingly silent, the emptiness of the space mirroring profound hollowness in Arthur's own life. Once, decades ago, before the relentless march of ambition and the suffocating weight of grief had consumed him, his life had been vibrantly full, not overflowing with the hollow glitter of riches, but brimming with the messy, chaotic, incandescent beauty of love and laughter. That was before Leo, before his son, his only child, Michael, had been tragically taken, swallowed whole by a senseless accident a decade prior. Since then, Arthur's existence had become a meticulously orchestrated routine of hollow achievements, a relentless pursuit of ever greater heights in his professional life, a desperate, ultimately futile, attempt to fill the gaping void left by Leo's absence. Every Sunday morning, regardless of weather or weariness, Arthur made a pilgrimage to Leo's grave. It was a solitary ritual, a sacred act of remembrance, the only consistent connection he had left with the ghost of his son, to the vibrant echoes of a life extinguished too soon. The small, weathered grave, nestled in a quiet, wind-swept cemetery perched on a hill overlooking the churning gray expanse of the ocean, lay on the outskirts of the historic coastal town, surrounded by ancient, gnarled oak trees that whispered secrets in the ceaseless wind, their branches skeletal fingers reaching towards the unforgiving sky. It was the one place, the only space in his carefully controlled, meticulously constructed world, where Arthur permitted himself to relinquish his guarded, granite-like demeanor, to shed the carefully cultivated armor of emotional detachment, and allow the raw, untamed torrent of grief to take hold, to wash over him, to consume him, to briefly, cathartically break him. On one such Sunday, the sky the color of bruised plums, the air thick with the salt-tinged tang of impending rain, as Arthur approached Leo's grave, a carefully arranged bouquet of lilies, Leo's favorite, clutched tightly in his glove hand, something utterly unusual, jarringly out of place, snagged his attention, arresting his measured stride. A young boy, perhaps no older than 12, his small frame dwarfed by the weathered granite of the headstone, was standing silently, motionless, by Leo's grave, his slender form silhouetted against the pale, watery morning light. The boy seemed lost in thought, his posture still, contemplative, his gaze fixed on the inscription etched into the cold stone, his presence radiating an almost unsettling quietude, a sense of profound absorption in a world unseen, unheard, intangible. He wasn't merely passing by, wasn't simply wandering aimlessly through the rows of weathered stones and silent monuments. He was there with a purpose, a deliberate intention, a quiet reverence that resonated with an almost unsettling familiarity. Arthur froze, his footsteps faltering, his breath catching in his throat, his senses sharpening, every instinct honed by years of solitude, by decades of emotional withdrawal, now suddenly, acutely alert. Watching from a distance, concealed by the ancient, gnarled trunk of an oak tree, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs, Arthur observed the boy, his gaze scrutinizing every detail of his small, solitary figure. The boy placed a small, almost pathetic bouquet of wildflowers, their colors muted by the gray morning light, their stems bound together with a piece of faded twine, gently, reverently on the grave, arranging them carefully against the cold stone, his movements delicate, almost reverent. And then he crouched down beside the headstone, his small frame folding onto the damp earth, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, his head bowed, his posture suggesting a whispered conversation, an intimate communion, a silent dialogue with the unseen presence residing beneath the cold earth, as though he were actually, tangibly, talking to Michael. Who was this boy, this fragile, solitary figure, intruding upon his sacred ritual of grief? And why was he here? At Leo's grave, drawn by an irresistible force of curiosity, a nascent, fragile hope stirred within the frozen landscape of his heart, a desperate yearning for connection, a primal need for answers to questions he hadn't even dared to articulate. Arthur cleared his throat deliberately, a sharp, resonant sound intended to make his presence known, to shatter the fragile silence, to disrupt the boy's quiet reverie. "Hey, boy," he called out, his voice, though undeniably firm, carrying a subtle tremor, a hint of unexpected vulnerability, a nascent flicker of long-dormant curiosity. "Hey, boy, what are you doing here?" His voice, though sharp, authoritative, accustomed to command, carried an undeniable undercurrent of curiosity, a tremor of unexpected emotion, a fragile hope for connection. The boy turned sharply, his movement sudden, almost startled, his small frame stiffening, his head snapping up, his gaze lifting from the weathered stone to meet Arthur's. His eyes wide, dark, luminous, pools of liquid shadow reflecting the gray morning light, were etched with palpable fear, a fleeting flash of startled apprehension. For a fleeting, suspended moment, their gazes locked, a silent, unspoken communication passing between them. Two figures from vastly different worlds, united inexplicably at the foot of a grave. Arthur's gaze piercing, inquisitive, accustomed to demanding answers, probing, assessing, analyzing, met the boy's frightened, yet undeniably defiant stare, a silent battle of wills, a fleeting clash of generations, a momentary confrontation of unspoken grief and dawning understanding. The boy, startled, frightened, yet subtly, almost imperceptibly, defiant, his chin lifting slightly, his small shoulders squaring, betraying a nascent spark of unexpected resilience, remained silent for a long, agonizing second. Then, without answering, without uttering a single word of explanation, without offering any justification for his presence at Leo's grave, the boy bolted, his small legs, surprisingly swift, surprisingly agile, carrying him away from the grave, away from Arthur, away from the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air, carrying him swiftly, desperately, through the silent rows of weathered headstones, through the whispering shadows of the ancient oak trees, disappearing into the dense, impenetrable woods that border the edge of the cemetery, swallowed whole by the encroaching gloom of the forest, vanishing like a phantom into the gray, unforgiving embrace of the winter landscape. David stood frozen at the edge of the woods, his breath ragged, his chest heaving, his heart pounding not just from the unexpected chase, the futile pursuit of the fleeting figure, but from the far more profound, far more unsettling, far more persistent chase within his own mind, the relentless pursuit of the unanswered questions now swirling within him, gathering momentum, coalescing into a storm of gnawing uncertainty, of rising anxiety, of a dawning, almost terrifying anticipation. Why was this boy, this fragile, ethereal figure, visiting Michael's grave? What possible connection could he have to his late son? And what carefully guarded secret, what long-buried truth, what life-altering revelation lay hidden beneath the surface of this fleeting, enigmatic encounter? That night, in the echoing silence of his vast, empty mansion, David couldn't sleep. The image of the boy, standing solitary and pensive at Michael's grave, haunted him, replaying endlessly in the darkened theater of his mind, a spectral presence refusing to be dismissed, refusing to be forgotten. There was something achingly familiar, undeniably resonant, about the way the boy had carried himself, the quiet dignity in his posture, the unspoken sorrow in his gaze, the almost ethereal grace of his solitary presence. Something that tugged relentlessly, insistently, at the frayed edges of David's memory, stirring long-dormant emotions, awakening a dormant yearning for connection, a primal need for understanding, a desperate, almost unbearable hunger for answers. Unable to shake the unsettling feeling, the persistent nagging of unanswered questions, the dawning conviction that this fleeting encounter held the key to something profoundly significant, something irrevocably life-changing, David resolved, with a quiet, unwavering determination, to find answers, to unravel the mystery, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how profoundly disruptive it might prove to be. The next morning, the sky still a bruised gray, the air still biting with the relentless winter chill, David placed a call to his personal investigator, Greg, a man whose name, whispered in hushed tones in certain circles, was synonymous with discretion, with efficiency, with an almost uncanny ability to solve even the most intricate mysteries, to unearth even most carefully buried secrets, to find answers where others had long given up hope. "I need you to find someone for me, Greg," David said, his tone sharp, urgent, betraying the barely contained tremor of anticipation, the undercurrent of rising anxiety, the quiet, desperate hope churning beneath the surface of his carefully constructed composure. "A boy," David continued, his voice now laced with quiet desperation, a raw vulnerability he rarely, almost never, permitted himself to express, about 12 years old. Thin build, dark hair. He paused, the image of the boy, solitary and fragile, replaying vividly in his mind, a ghost in the machine of his meticulously ordered world. "He was at my son's grave yesterday." Greg raised an eyebrow, his voice calm, professional, utterly unfazed by the cryptic nature of the request, the raw emotion bleeding through David's usually controlled tone. "At Michael's grave?" Greg repeated, his tone questioning, yet betraying no hint of surprise, no flicker of judgment, his professionalism unwavering, his discretion absolute. But Greg, his voice betraying no hint of surprise, no flicker of curiosity, no trace of personal opinion, simply nodded, his professionalism absolute, his discretion unyielding. "Consider it done, Mr. Calloway. Any idea where he went?" David asked then, his voice barely audible, his gaze dropping to the polished surface of his desk, his posture betraying a rare, almost unsettling vulnerability. David shook his head slowly, deliberately, a gesture of defeat, a quiet admission of his own helplessness, his own profound ignorance, his own utter lack of understanding of the forces that were now, irrevocably, reshaping his life. "He ran into the woods," David replied, his voice trailing off, the words inadequate to capture the vastness of the unknown, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on him, the chilling certainty that his carefully constructed world was about to be profoundly, irrevocably changed. "I need to know," David continued, his voice now gaining a sharper edge, a desperate urgency, a quiet, almost frantic, determination to unravel the mystery, to unearth the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how profoundly disruptive it might prove to be. "I need to know who he is, where he lives, and why." He paused, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper from a ghost of man, his gaze lost in the labyrinthine corridors of memory, his mind transported back, in an instant, to another world, another time, another life. "And why?" he repeated, his voice now cracking with emotion, his words barely a breath, a silent plea for understanding, a desperate yearning for connection, a fragile, almost extinguished hope for answers. Why he was there. For days, Greg, a master of his shadowy craft, a virtuoso of information gathering, a silent ghost moving through the digital and physical landscapes of the city, worked tirelessly, relentlessly, using all the vast resources at his disposal, leaving no stone unturned, no lead uninvestigated, no avenue unexplored in his meticulous, almost surgical pursuit of the elusive truth. David, meanwhile, found himself consumed, utterly consumed, by thought of the boy, the enigma, the ghost child who had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere at Leo's grave, shattering the fragile equilibrium of his carefully constructed world, igniting a firestorm of unanswered questions within the frozen landscape of his heart. His once laser-focused mind, usually laser-focused, relentlessly, almost obsessively, occupied with the intricate complexities of billion-dollar business deals, the relentless pursuit of ever greater profits, the intricate calculations of high-stakes investments, now drifted endlessly, aimlessly, compulsively, back to that brief, unsettling encounter in the cemetery, replaying the scene over and over, dissecting every detail, analyzing every nuance, searching desperately for a hidden meaning, a subtle clue, a flicker of understanding in the vast, unknowable darkness of the mystery that now enveloped him. 5 days later, the winter sky still a bruised gray, the air still biting with a relentless chill, Greg returned to David's mansion, his arrival announced by the hushed whisper of the intercom, his presence a subtle disruption in the carefully curated silence of the vast, echoing halls. Greg entered David's study, a room of mahogany and leather, shadowed corners and muted light. Carrying a thick manila file, its weight promising answers, its contents holding potential to irrevocably reshape David's world. "I have answers," Greg began, his voice professional, measured, utterly devoid of emotion, handing David a file with a quiet, almost ceremonial gravity. "Answers," David repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, his hand trembling slightly as he reached the file, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a mixture of anticipation and dread, hope and fear, battling within him for dominance. "Answers," Greg confirmed, his gaze direct, unwavering, his posture radiating a quiet certainty, his professionalism absolute, his discretion unyielding. "His name is Ethan," Greg stated, his voice flat, factual, yet carrying the weight of unspoken revelations, the promise of life-altering truths. "Ethan," David repeated, the name unfamiliar, yet somehow resonating with subtle, almost subconscious, familiarity, a faint echo of a long-forgotten memory, a whisper of a past he had deliberately, carefully, meticulously suppressed, buried deep beneath the layers of grief and denial. "Ethan," David repeated again, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper from a ghost of a man, his gaze lost in the labyrinthine corridors of memory, his mind transported back, in an instant, to another world, another time, another life. "Ethan," David repeated again, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper from a ghost of a man, his gaze lost in the labyrinthine corridors of memory, his mind transported back, in an instant, to another world, another time, another life. He began to open the file, his hands shaking now, his fingers fumbling with the clasp, his breath catching his throat, the weight of anticipation, the gravity of the moment, pressing down on him with almost unbearable force. "Ethan," David repeated again, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper from a ghost of a man, his gaze lost in the labyrinthine corridors of memory, his mind transported back, in an instant, to another world, another time, another life. "Ethan," David repeated again, his voice barely audible, a ghost of a whisper from a ghost of a man, his gaze lost in the labyrinthine corridors of memory, his mind transported back, in an instant, to another world, another time, another life.